Eleanor adjusted the strap of her canvas tote bag as she stepped through the glass doors of Prestige Motors, the kind of place where the air smelled like leather and money. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet but bright, the kind of day that felt full of small possibilities. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She wasn't even sure she'd buy anything. But her daughter was graduating college in a few weeks, and Eleanor had been saving for months, carefully, quietly, to give her something meaningful. Not flashy, just dependable. A car that wouldn't break down on her first road trip as a grown woman. She wore her usual outfit, faded jeans, clean white sneakers, and a soft blue sweater she'd bought on sale 2 winters ago. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, no makeup, just a swipe of lip balm. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a showroom full of 6-figure sedans and SUVs with names she could barely pronounce. But she didn't feel out of place, not at first. She'd worked hard her whole life. She'd raised a smart, kind daughter on her own for years before meeting her husband. She knew the value of things even if she didn't flaunt it. Inside, the dealership gleamed. Polished floors reflected the sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Cars sat like museum pieces, sleek, silent, untouchable. A few salespeople stood near the coffee bar, laughing over espresso cups. None of them looked up when she entered. She wandered slowly past a silver SUV with doors that opened like wings, then a midnight blue sedan with a price tag that made her blink. She didn't flinch. She just kept walking, reading the little placards, imagining her daughter behind the wheel, safe and confident. Finally, she stopped near a mid-range luxury sedan, still expensive, but within reach if she stretched her budget just right. She glanced around for someone to ask a question. A young man in a crisp navy blazer finally noticed her. He didn't smile. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to figure out if she was lost or just browsing. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice polite but distant. "Yes, please," Eleanor said warmly. "I'd like to take a look at this one. Maybe even a quick test drive if that's possible." He glanced at the car, then back at her clothes, then at her worn tote bag. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Just a little stiffening of the shoulders, a slight narrowing of the eyes. "We usually reserve test drives for serious buyers," he said, folding his arms. "Do you have financing pre-approved?" Eleanor blinked. "I haven't gotten that far yet. I wanted to see how it feels first. I've been saving up and I'm ready to make a decision soon." He gave a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We get a lot of people in here just looking. Takes time away from customers who are actually ready to sign." She felt a flicker of embarrassment, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand, but I am serious. I just want to be sure before I commit." At that he sighed, as if she'd asked him to carry her groceries to the car. "Look, ma'am, we're pretty booked today. And honestly, this model, it's not exactly entry-level. You might want to check out something simpler." The words landed like a pebble in her chest. Not cruel, not shouted, but sharp enough to sting. She wasn't used to being dismissed. She'd spent years working double shifts at a community clinic, listening to people's worries with patience and care. She'd never judged someone by their shoes or their accent. And now, standing in this bright, cold room, she felt invisible. Not because she was quiet, but because she didn't look like money. Still, she didn't argue. She just nodded. "All right. Thank you anyway." She turned to leave, but before she could reach the door, a woman in a tailored suit appeared. Manager, badge gleaming. She'd clearly overheard. "Excuse me," the woman said, voice smooth but firm. "I'm sorry, but we're closing the showroom for a private client soon. You'll need to step outside." Eleanor stopped. "I was just leaving." "Now would be best," the manager added, already turning toward the young man, already moving on. There was no apology. No "have a nice day." Just the quiet assumption that she didn't belong, and that her presence was somehow an inconvenience. Outside, the morning sun felt suddenly harsh. She walked to her 10-year-old sedan parked down the street, the one with the patched-up bumper and the squeaky driver's door. She got in, sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, breathing slowly. She wasn't angry. Not really. More sad. Sad that someone could look at her and see only what she wasn't wearing. Not the love she carried for her daughter. Not the years of quiet sacrifice. Not the careful planning that went into every dollar she saved. She started the car. The engine coughed once, then purred to life. Reliable, humble hers. As she drove home, she thought about calling the whole thing off. Maybe she'd just give her daughter the cash and let her pick something herself. But then she remembered the look on her daughter's face last week when she'd said, "Mom, you always put everyone else first. This time let me be proud of you for treating yourself too." Eleanor smiled faintly. She hadn't planned to treat herself. But maybe she'd earned the right to be seen. She didn't know it yet, but the next morning, the quietest kind of justice would roll up to that same dealership in the form of a black Rolls-Royce, and everything would change. But for now, she just drove home windows down, letting the wind brush her cheeks, holding her head high even when no one was watching. The house was quiet when she pulled into the driveway. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the comfortable kind. The kind that settles in after years of shared meals, laundry left in baskets, and books stacked on nightstands. It was a modest home, nothing fancy from the outside. A small garden in front, a porch swing that creaked just enough to be soothing, and flower boxes under the windows that she tended to every Sunday morning. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the familiar tick of the cooling car. The dealership incident kept replaying in her mind, not the anger but the feeling of being erased, like she hadn't mattered enough to even be spoken to kindly. She sighed, grabbed her tote bag and stepped out. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee lingered from the morning. She kicked off her sneakers by the door and padded into the kitchen. On the counter sat a note in neat handwriting. "Late meeting. Back by 7. Leftover soup in fridge. Don't forget your tea." She smiled. He always remembered the tea. She wasn't one to dwell on slights, but this one stuck. Maybe because it felt so unnecessary. She'd been polite. She'd asked simple questions. She hadn't demanded anything. And yet, she'd been treated like a nuisance. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and leaned against the counter, watching steam begin to curl from the spout. When the front door opened an hour later, she didn't turn around right away. She heard the soft thud of briefcase hitting the hall table, the rustle of a jacket being hung, the familiar sigh that meant the day was finally over. Then footsteps, steady, calm, and a warm presence beside her in the kitchen. "You're home early," she said, still facing the stove. "Meeting wrapped up sooner than expected," he replied, pouring himself a glass of water. He glanced at her. "You okay?" She hesitated. She didn't want to make it a big deal. Didn't want him to storm off or call someone important or turn it into a scene. That wasn't who they were. They lived quietly, deliberately. He could buy half the city if he wanted, but he chose to eat dinner at the table with her, to fix the leaky faucet himself, to remember her favorite flower was lilacs. Still, she trusted him. Always had. She turned, leaning back against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "Went to that dealership today. The one downtown. You know the fancy one with the glass walls?" He nodded slowly, watching her face. "I just wanted to look at that sedan we talked about, for our girl's graduation." He waited. She took a breath. "They didn't let me test drive it. Said I didn't look like a serious buyer." His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, like a shadow passing over calm water. "What did they say exactly?" he asked, voice low. She shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Not much. Just that they reserve test drives for serious customers. The manager came out and basically asked me to leave. Said they were closing for a private client." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and gently took her hand. His palm was warm, rough from years of tinkering with old radios and garden tools, not boardrooms. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She blinked, surprised. She'd expected frustration, maybe even a sharp remark about how people still judged by appearances, but all he gave her was quiet understanding. "It's fine," she said, squeezing his hand back. "Really, I guess I forgot how much people still assume." He didn't argue, didn't say, "I'll buy the whole place," didn't puff up with indignation. He just stood there holding her hand, letting her feel seen in a way the dealership hadn't. Later, over dinner, homemade vegetable stew and crusty bread, they talked about their daughter, about how she'd called that afternoon, excited about her first job interview, about how she'd insisted on paying for her own textbooks last semester, even though they'd offered, about how proud they both were. They didn't talk about the dealership again. But as they cleared the dishes, he paused by the sink and said, "You know, you've earned every bit of kindness in this world. More than most." She looked up, surprised by the soft intensity in his voice. "And you don't need a fancy car or a designer bag to prove your worth." he added, drying a plate with a towel. But it still hurts when people act like you're less than. She nodded, throat tight. Yeah, it does. He didn't say anything else. Just finished drying the dishes, put them away, and went to check the mail. But she saw it. The quiet set of his jaw, the way his shoulders squared just slightly. Not with anger, but with resolve. He wasn't the type to make grand gestures. But when something mattered, really mattered, he moved like a river, calm on the surface, unstoppable underneath. That night, as they sat on the porch swing watching fireflies blink in the dusk, she leaned her head on his shoulder. The air was warm, the neighborhood quiet except for a dog barking a few houses down. You know, she said softly, I still want to get her that car. Not because it's fancy, but because she deserves something reliable, something that says you made it. He wrapped an arm around her. Then she'll have it. No, she said, smiling. We'll get it, together. He kissed the top of her head. Together. Inside, the house glowed with lamplight. Outside, the world kept turning. And in that moment, none of the day's sting mattered. Because here, in this quiet space they'd built over decades, she was never invisible. She was loved. Not for what she wore or drove or owned, but for who she was. Steady, kind, and full of quiet strength. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew this. Whatever happened, they'd face it the same way they always had. With grace, with each other, and without needing to shout to be heard. And sometimes that was enough. More than enough. The morning sun hit the dealership's glass front just right, sharp, bright, almost theatrical. Inside, the usual hum of polite chatter and espresso machines had just begun. Salespeople straightened their ties, wiped down dashboards, and scrolled through emails, unaware that the day was about to tilt on its axis. At exactly 9:03 a.m., a black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided to a stop at the curb. Not with a screech or a showy rev, but with the kind of smooth silence that only comes from something built to perfection. The car looked less like a vehicle and more like a statement. Polished, powerful, and utterly out of place among the usual luxury sedans parked out front. A uniformed driver stepped out, opened the rear door with gloved hands, and stood at attention. Then he emerged. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself like someone used to being listened to, not because he demanded it, but because he'd earned it. He wore a dark suit, simple and well-cut. No flashy watch, no loud cologne. Just calm, quiet presence. He didn't scan the lot like a tourist. He walked straight to the entrance, hands in his pockets, eyes steady. Inside, the young sales associate from the day before was laughing with a coworker near the coffee station. He glanced up and froze mid-sip. Something about the man walking in made the room feel smaller. The manager, still nursing her second latte, looked up from her tablet. Her smile faded the second she saw him. She'd seen his face before, not in person, but in business magazines, in tech conference panels and headlines about quiet philanthropy and billion-dollar innovations that changed how people lived. She knew exactly who this was, and her stomach dropped. He didn't head for the flashiest car, didn't ask for champagne or a VIP tour. He walked calmly to the center of the showroom, looked around once, then turned to the nearest employee, a nervous-looking intern holding a clipboard. I'm looking for the person who asked my wife to leave this place yesterday, he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The intern's eyes widened. He stammered, I'll get the manager. Within seconds, the manager was there, smoothing her blazer, forcing a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sir, welcome to Prestige Motors. How can we— I'm not here to buy a car, he interrupted gently, but firmly. I'm here because my wife was treated like she didn't belong here. And I'd like to understand why. The room went still. Conversations died. Even the espresso machine seemed to pause. The manager's face flushed. There must be some misunderstanding. We pride ourselves on excellent customer service. Her name is Eleanor, he said, cutting through the rehearsed line. She came in yesterday wearing jeans and a sweater. She asked politely to test drive a sedan. She was saving to buy a car for her daughter's college graduation. Instead of helping her, your staff dismissed her. Then you asked her to leave. He didn't raise his voice, didn't point a finger, but every word landed like a stone in still water. I've built my life on the idea that how you treat people matters more than what they can buy from you, he continued. And yesterday your team failed that test. The manager swallowed hard. I didn't realize— No, he said softly. You didn't. And that's the problem. By now, half the staff had gathered near the service desk, pretending to file paperwork but watching everything. The young sales associate who'd turned Eleanor away stood near the back, face pale, arms crossed like he was trying to disappear. The man turned slightly and looked right at him. Not with anger, with disappointment. The kind a teacher gives a student who knows better. "You looked at her clothes and decided she wasn't worth your time," he said. "But you missed everything that mattered. She spent her life caring for others, working in clinics, raising a brilliant daughter, giving without expecting anything back. And all she asked for was a chance to see if a car felt right." He paused, then added, "That's not window shopping. That's responsibility." The silence stretched. No one moved. Then, to everyone's surprise, he pulled out his phone, not to make a threat but to send a quick message. A minute later, his driver reappeared at the door with a folder. "I brought the pre-approval letter she would have shown you," he said, handing it to the manager. "Full payment, ready to go. 2 vehicles, actually. One for her daughter, one to donate to a women's shelter she supports." The manager stared at the paper like it might burn her fingers. "I'm not here to shame you," he said, his tone softening just a little. "I'm here to remind you that dignity isn't reserved for people who look a certain way. Kindness costs nothing. And assumptions? They can cost you everything." He turned to leave, then stopped. "By the way, I've already spoken with your regional director. He'll be calling you shortly about new training protocols. Starting next week, every employee here will go through bias awareness sessions, not as punishment, but as a reset." He gave a small nod. "Have a good day." And just like that, he walked out. The Rolls-Royce waited, engine silent. He got in without looking back. Inside, no one spoke for a full minute. The manager sank into a chair, the approval letter trembling in her hand. The young sales associate stared at the floor, shame burning in his chest, not because he'd been caught, but because he finally saw what he'd done. Outside, the Rolls-Royce pulled away, smooth and quiet, leaving behind not chaos, but clarity. And for the first time in a long time, the showroom didn't feel like a place to sell cars. It felt like a place where people might finally start seeing each other. The next few days passed quietly at home. The kind of calm that settles after a storm you didn't even realize was coming. Nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no headlines, no sudden changes in routine. But something had shifted like a stone dropped in a pond. The ripples were spreading even if you couldn't see them from the shore. She didn't ask what he'd done. She didn't need to. She knew him well enough to recognize the quiet certainty in his movements, the way he lingered over his coffee that morning, the slight softening around his eyes when he looked at her. He hadn't gone to make a scene. He'd gone to restore balance, and that was enough. Meanwhile, across town, the dealership was anything but calm. By mid-morning, the day after the Rolls-Royce visit, a call came through to the manager's office. It wasn't angry. It wasn't scolding. It was worse, it was disappointed. The regional director, a man who rarely involved himself in day-to-day operations, spoke for 20 minutes. He didn't fire anyone, but he made it clear this wasn't just about one customer. It was about the culture they'd allowed to grow. Within 48 hours, an email went out to every employee at every Prestige Motors location in the state. Mandatory training, not the usual how to close a sales seminar, but something new. Seeing the person, not the package. Led by a respected diversity and inclusion consultant, the sessions would cover unconscious bias, active listening, and the simple truth that you never know who someone is or who they love just by how they dress. The young sales associate who'd turned her away signed up for the first session. He didn't have to, but he did. That night he sat at his kitchen table staring at his reflection in the dark window. He thought about his own mother, how she'd worked 2 jobs in worn-out shoes just to keep food on the table. How proud she'd been when he got this job, and how ashamed she'd be if she knew he'd treated someone like her with such coldness. He wrote a note. Short, honest, no excuses. He didn't expect a reply. He just needed to say it. Back at home, she was folding laundry when the letter arrived. Plain envelope, no logo, just her name in neat handwriting. She opened it slowly, expecting a bill or a flyer. Instead, she found 2 things: a formal apology from the dealership's corporate office and a handwritten note from the young man who'd turned her away. "I'm sorry," it read. "I judged you by your clothes and missed the person underneath. I hope you'll accept my apology, and I hope your daughter loves her new car." She read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the book she kept on her nightstand. the one filled with notes from her daughter, old grocery lists, pressed flowers, and other small pieces of a life well lived. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't gloat. But she did feel something warm and quiet bloom in her chest. Hope. Not just that things had changed for her, but that maybe, just maybe, they'd change for someone else too. A week later, the regional director himself called, not to apologize again, but to invite her to speak. Not at a big event, not on a stage, but to a small group of new hires during their orientation. "We want them to hear it from you," he said gently. "What it feels like to be unseen, and why it matters to look deeper." She almost said no. She wasn't a public speaker. She didn't like attention. But then she thought of her daughter who'd once told her, "Mom, your quiet strength is louder than most people's shouting." So she said yes. She stood in a modest conference room, no podium, just a circle of chairs. 20 fresh-faced employees looked up at her, some nervous, some curious. She didn't give a speech. She just told her story, simply, honestly. How she'd walked in hoping to do something kind. How she'd left feeling small. How she'd gone home and almost given up. "But then I remembered," she said, "that my worth wasn't decided by someone else's first impression. And neither is yours. You'll meet all kinds of people in this job. Some will look like they belong. Some won't. But every single one of them deserves to be treated like they matter, because they do." Afterward, 3 people came up to thank her. One had tears in her eyes. "My dad got turned away from a place like this once," she whispered. "He never tried again." That moment stayed with her. Meanwhile, her husband watched from the sidelines, not interfering, not taking credit. He knew this wasn't about him. It was about her voice, her grace, her refusal to let bitterness take root. He'd simply cleared the path so she could walk it on her own terms. And the dealership? It didn't magically become perfect overnight. But things changed. Staff started greeting everyone at the door, whether they wore suits or sweatshirts. Test drives were offered without judgment. The coffee bar became a place where people actually talked, not just waited. One afternoon, the manager, now humbler, quieter, saw an older woman in worn shoes browsing the used car section. She walked over, smiled, and asked, "Can I help you find something reliable? No assumptions, no hurry, just kindness." The woman ended up buying a car that day, and as she drove off, waving through the window, the manager felt something she hadn't in years. Pride, not in a sale, but in doing the right thing. Back home, as evening fell, she sat on the porch with her husband, sipping tea. The air smelled like rain and garden soil. "You know," she said softly, "I think the best part wasn't getting an apology. It was seeing them try to do better." He nodded. "People can change. Sometimes they just need a mirror." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for not making it about power. For making it about respect." He kissed her hair. "You taught me that a long time ago." And in that quiet moment, with fireflies beginning to blink in the dusk, they both knew. Real change doesn't roar. It whispers. And if you're listening, it can heal more than you ever imagined.